All right. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to part one of Healing Centered Engagement for peers and coaches. I'm so happy that you are all here as members of the IARCP. And I'm so happy that you have joined us to continue your professional development efforts. I am going to go ahead and pass the mic on over to Jessie Heffernan, who is a recovery coach, professional designee, one of CCAR's core trainers, and also a member of the IARCP. Jessie, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Misha. And I see we've got some other folks joining too, so I'll give it a moment here. I'm going to get the share screen up. Are you sure you don't want to use Adobe Connect?
No.
We hate Adobe Connect.
We've outgrown that, Jessie.
Okay, fair enough. I was just checking. It was a good little segue joke for trainers and everybody as we move into all of this. Yeah, we've abandoned Adobe Connect as well. And bye Adobe. Yeah. So hello everyone and welcome. Oh, Stacy's here. Hello, Stacy. We were just texting earlier. So my name is Jessie Heffernan. I am a recovery coach professional, as Misha stated, and also recently, which is kind of related to this, went through a training, which I'm not going to promote, but I'm definitely going to encourage folks to check out as far as healing centered engagement. So I went through and became healing center engaged practitioner. It's an amazing training, and just a little bit of kind of background in all of this. And we'll talk more about it throughout the course of the workshop today, but I was introduced to this concept of healing centered engagement about 3 years ago from an article by Dr. Sean Ginwright. And through the article, there were just all these principles and values and alignments that I saw with recovery coaching and with recovery coaching services and peer services and things like that. And it really just, it kind of sparked something in me to really get re-engaged and see how this work aligns. I've always been interested in seeing like how other schools of thought and how other concepts line up with what we're doing here, like in nonprofit management and what we're doing with recovery coaches and peers and in recovery oriented systems of care work. So I'm always looking at these things. And to me, this is just one of those pieces that align really well with it. So learning objectives, just understand the differences between healing centered and trauma informed approaches. And so kind of a disclaimer, if you will, I know that practicing like trauma informed care may not necessarily be our lane, but it's certainly something that I'm sure that overlaps with a lot of the work that we do, right? I know from my own experience, the way that I view the lens of trauma comes in from the sense of like managing my own stuff, right? And that's been a lot of this, right? With like looking at all these different aspects of how I interact with people as a coach, what stuff comes up for me. And, and when we talk, when we're doing trainings, right? And we're talking about like, where do these stories come from? And why did this stuff happen? And why am I having reactions to different folks? And so all those things to say, like, I'm not by any means trying to train people on trauma, but it's in our world. And it's something that comes up constantly. And this concept is to really, like, I think help us develop a framework of that we're as recovery coaches, maybe it's not so much trauma informed care work that we're doing, but we're doing healing centered work. And that it's a really important transition, and that the language that you'll see is going to resonate with and align with a lot of what we talk about in CCAR. 3 ways to improve strategies and understand appreciative inquiry and peer client participation and how they relate to healing centered engagement. So again, just some follow-up concepts that we'll go through tomorrow, and hopefully, like, again, these are abridged versions or primers, if you will, of a lot of these concepts, and I'll provide resources and materials if you wish to continue to pursue some of these things. But I'm hoping that this can be, again, an engaging and challenging conversation to and look at your stuff, look at your role as a coach, look at your role as a trainer, and implement some new language into your lexicon. Let's see, just watching. Okay. I watch the chat too, and it always just like pops up for me. So this was an interesting thing that I was introduced rather than like working agreements or safe space agreements. There was this concept of courageous space agreements, if you will. And the concept behind those is that it encourages dialogue, recognizing the difference and holding each person accountable to do the work of sharing experiences and coming to new understandings. A feat that's hard and typically uncomfortable. And one of the things that I like about this, as opposed to just, kind of like working agreements or safe space agreements, is that oftentimes I'm going into these spaces and I'm inviting people in these spaces to be challenged, right? To not just feel safe, because feeling safe for me is just kind of like staying in what I know. But to move beyond that, to feel challenged and to like actually step into a spot of like courage and say like, okay, maybe there's some things here that I don't completely understand. Maybe I've made some mistakes, maybe I've said some things, or maybe there's some ways that I can move my own thoughts and my own belief systems so I can better connect with people. And so that's what I'm inviting folks to do here through this concept of a courageous space. And I just wanted to ask too, is there anything that anyone on here, I'm really erring on the side of like trusting all of you, like especially like in this role as recovery coach professionals and knowing about agreements and all this stuff. But I want to ask, is there anything that folks need? Isn't Randy producing? So anything that folks need before we get going to feel supported and challenged in this 2 days that we have together? Randy, can you change the slide? Oh, wait, never mind. So just show of hands, who's good with this as it stands? Show of digital hands or literal hands, either one works. You can hit, what is it? Alt-Y to raise your digital hand, which I love those little shortcuts. Okay. Looks like we're mostly good. Cool. We'll move on then. So question, who's familiar with trauma-informed care? Are coaches trauma-informed, and how do you know? And so I just want to get some thoughts from some folks, if people want to think about this for a moment and hear from you. What are your thoughts about these questions? Are you familiar with it? Are we trauma-informed, and how do you know? Would anyone like to answer? Again, you can raise your literal or digital hand. I should be able to see all of you. Jackie, go ahead.
Hey, this is Jackie. I think we're familiar with it. I am one of the trainers for trauma-informed care, so I'm familiar with it.
Mm-hmm.
But to respond, if coaches are, as much as I would like to say yes, I want to say they may be intellectually aware, but their practices doesn't show that they are.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah, no. So aware of the concepts, but maybe not the practice itself.
Yeah.
Okay. Other thoughts, things that come up for people. Are you aware of trauma-informed care? Have you been trained in it before? Do you think coaches are trauma-informed?
Well, if I can, Jesse, while somebody raised their hand, this is how do I know?
Mm-hmm.
So some of the our experiences is that if we call our peers associates.
Mm-hmm.
So if an associate, we have a lot of associates that's suspended right now. They're kicked out for about 30 days. And that tells me that because we have not figured out how to de-escalate, diffuse, refrain, re-engage. And so that's what tells me, that's how I know. Okay, so I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
I would add that our staff here are informed intellectually and maybe more in relation to their own history, but they're not able to translate that to other types of trauma that they're not personally involved in or have history with.
Any other thoughts? Ruth?
Hi there, Jesse. Thanks so much for this. I mean, I'm loving it already. From a coaching perspective, I do not like the trauma-informed frame. It's way too close to clinical and diagnostic for me, for my liking. So your framing here, sort of really speaks to me, and that's why I'm here today and tomorrow. But to look at the questions on this particular slide, of course, I'm informed by trauma informed care. Sort of as a recovery coach, I am trauma informed. That's a specific training and experiential history. But the question that's of most interest to me on this slide is the third one. How do you know? And for me, the value of any training in our particular roles, stay in your lane, the value to me of any training is, how does it make me, or how does it help me be a more skillful communicator? So I'm going to know by how I hear you talk. I'm going to know about how you address folks you're actually in conversation with. I'm going to know about how you talk about folks you're working with when they're not there. And it's, sort of so that essentially it's the same standard as everything else. Sort of by your actions shall ye be known. And so that for me is the most interesting question on this slide. And I want to thank you again for this material.
Any other thoughts? Meisha?
Hi, everyone. I really like the idea of staying in our lane, and kind of like what Ruth said, when I hear trauma, I hear clinical, and I hear like outsourcing that to someone that is able to deal with the trauma and unpack the trauma, because I don't think that a recovery coach is not that. But with that being said, Jesse, and I was speaking to you earlier about this before everyone joined, when recoveries come to us, they don't come to us in isolation. They don't come to us like, oh, the only thing that I have is this one addiction to this, one thing. Sometimes people come to us with trauma, and sometimes people come to us with multiple addictions, and sometimes people come to us with mental illness. So I think it's a matter of knowing how to handle those situations when they do come up, because I don't think it's a if they come up, it's a when they come up situation. So I'm really interested in your perspective on this, and how we can kind of parlay that into our recovery coaching professional development. So thank you.
Go ahead, John.
Nita would have heard me speak about this before. There's a lot of professionals out there that when it comes to addiction, their agenda is to make everyone believe that everyone with an addiction had trauma. And I just don't believe that's true. Of course, there's lots of trauma involved, but actually, some of us, me included, had remarkable, fantastic childhoods full of love and joy and all sorts of things. So there's a few professionals out there that seem to be ramming this everyone's traumatized thing. And to me, it's just a bit out of balance. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, so I know that the prevailing view, many voices talking about the connection between the loss of attachment, trauma in childhood with addiction. But I think it's good to have a repertoire of like understanding about what is being understood about addiction, and so that we can enter into a space more informed and we can make, we can be more resourced. So it might be in some case asking somebody, because we approach people as they are the resource. They tell us who they are, asking them what's going on with you. And what they want to say in that space, and maybe they don't want to be asked. They don't want to talk about their childhood, But I think it's good to know the variety of ways that the variety of what we can guess might be happening with somebody, so we could be more sensitive and nuanced when we enter into their space. Yeah, I mean, I think we should do more professional development around this, but not to teach it, to prescribe it, but to consider it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Stacy?
Hi, everyone. So this is kind of one of those things where, as the people who develop training, we're constantly asked, like, should we include things like this in the RCA, and should we, do and add, additional modules and training, and I kind of side with Ruth a little bit on this, because the more that you inform, or the more that you give people information, the less curious, the less asking questions, the less, because then we just come with our, this is what you need to do in order to be well, I like the fact that I don't know a lot about certain pathways or certain medications and things such as that, because I don't want to go into it with the answers. That's not my role as a coach, right? My role is to ask some good questions, to treat that person as their own best resource, and to figure out what their goals are. And I think the more I have in my head about trauma, childhood, whatever, I might be imparting some of those things on them by the way I frame questions, or by the way. So I think, it's good to have an idea so that I don't use language that might further traumatize somebody. Like, I need to be informed so that I'm not creating more trauma, or asking questions in a way that might, I hate to use the word trigger, but Phil's not here, so I'll use it. That might trigger somebody. But you know what I mean? Like, I think those are the things that, as a coach, like, I need to know how to not do further harm, and I need to know those things. But I would want to keep those, the real specificity and the prescriptive stuff to the clinician, to the people I would refer somebody to. And John, I agree with you too. I think, we have always done, at least CCAR has always tried to, put on it that it's not really about, like, the, everybody's co-occurring. Just because somebody had an addiction, then they also have this thing. And I think that we've always tried to keep it separate, because there are two separate things going on, and it really depends on what the person wants to work on, and that really drives the work that we do, and if we started telling everybody that, well, if you have an addiction, you also have a mental illness, like, we could be also making people not want to get help because maybe they don't want that label, or maybe, and so I think we just have to tread very lightly when we do these things. And I think I agree with Deb, like, it's good to be informed and to know how not to press somebody's buttons, or, go into some of this stuff. But I don't think that it's so that we can take the place of, providing that in-depth care that a clinician would do to unpack trauma. So but I think if we go in, again, treating people as a resource, meeting people where they're at, and letting them lead, the way, then to me, that's about pretty good. You know, that's about as good as we can get. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. One more, Mr. Anderson.
Thanks. I'll turn on my video. So I'm multitasking in my garage, but this is great. I like what Stacy kind of took a little bit of my thunder, but that's okay, what she said. So I think back to the time, so I'm also a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, and I think back to what my objection or the reasons why I didn't want to become a recovery coach is I didn't want to try to figure out how to navigate those multiple lanes or those, which hat am I wearing, right? And I think I like what Stacy said, is that I have to constantly remind myself, if I'm in a coaching role, not to bring that clinical piece into my coaching. Like, and I think, although I think I want to be informed and know about trauma and know how people react to it and what signs to look for and like how can I like understand that better. But I agree with Stacy. I don't want to bring it into that lane. Like and it's hard for me being a trained clinician, oftentimes like, which hat am I wearing? And I have to remember this, like, right, okay, got my coach hat on, let's stay in that lane. So anyways, Stacy again kind of stole a lot of what I wanted to say, but I also wanted to say that as I want to know about it and I want to know how to recognize the signs of it. And when, you know, like, and I like the word activated better than triggered. I agree with that. So thanks. That's just kind of what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Yeah. So one of what I get a lot, like when I go and talk to counties and clinicians and sometimes hospitals, and they're interested in this new world of, hold on, I'm going to pause 1 second. I just want to say like how grateful I am to be doing this training with other recovery coach professionals that I don't have to explain everything to, like to be with a group like this and be like, we know, and it's great, instead of having to like, you know, spoon feed it to people sometimes. And like, they just don't understand all of this. So this is great. So when people contract and they're like, hey, we want to do a recovery coach training, but is it trauma informed, right? Like they want to ask those things. Is it trauma informed? And I think I even had that question that I posed a while ago, maybe to Stacy or Phil. And when I look at like the 5 guiding principles of trauma informed care are safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. And then I say, yeah, it is. Like all those things are covered, right? So yes, I have no problem telling anybody that this is a trauma-informed training and that those principles are woven throughout the entire piece. And sometimes I feel like that's just the thing I have to give them. Like they're like, oh, right, like cool. Now we can get it. Now we can feel like we're on the same lane. However, the delivery method of how we do those things echoes so much of what all of you said, right? In that it isn't coming from a therapeutic or counseling approach. It's coming from that person first, strength-based approach, where we're meeting someone where they're at and treating them like a resource, right? So yes, it's trauma informed. No, we're not doing it the same way you are, kind of a thing. And a lot of folks kind of like are grateful for that. And to your point, John, too, I hear you and I understand too, like not everyone's substance use disorder is activated by trauma, right? Sometimes it's like the first pain med someone gets and it just turns things on, right? And so we're not always coming at it from that. However, I believe too that in someone's active substance use, they can experience maybe some trauma that way, right? Just in and of itself, right? So again, it's not necessarily about like what happened to you, and even moving away from some of that language that we'll get into. So again, trauma-informed care, and I've worked with organizations. There were like some local hospitals and places that are like, we're going to get our entire staff trauma-informed. And it was just so fascinating to me that like they wanted to integrate this practice into everywhere because they wanted, especially in this hospital, they wanted their staff to have a common language so they could practice more empathy with people, which I'm like, that's amazing. And they got tons of kudos and everybody loved the hospital. And I stopped and I said, how come they're not empathetic already? Right? Why are they not like already treating people well? Like what makes you have to stop and do that, you know? And so like, and of course, like when you deflate someone's balloon like that, you don't get invited back to meetings, and that's okay. so I get the importance and why, like, I watch buzzwords and like trauma-informed care has been like the thing for a little while, right? And it's also provided me personally with a ton of great healing, right? It's provided me with a ton of great like insight into my own story and my own why as to what's come up for me. And I'm going to share a little bit about like those components, simply from the place of like sharing my own experience around trauma, and another concept called trauma absences sets up the framework for when we start talking about healing-centered engagement and how it looks at more of a holistic view of what recovery can look like. So here's like ACEs, right? The acute or the adverse childhood experiences, right? The one test you don't want to get an A or a B in. There's multiple like studies out there. If you've got 6 or more, like the likelihood of mental health and substance use disorder, cocaine use, heroin use, like goes through the roof, right? And I remember first seeing this and I was like, oh, like for me, what it did, especially when I saw some of the statistics around it, is like a lot of time those things like statistics help me not feel so alone, right? I'm like, oh, like other people have experienced this, right? It's kind of like the same thing when I hear there's 25 million Americans in recovery. I'm like, oh, that helps, right? And so knowing that other people experience these things and that these are some of the things that folks experience that they're coming to the door with, right? It's again, it's not necessarily me sitting down with a recovery and saying like, let's discuss your ACEs score, right? It's knowing that like inevitably for me, recoveries over a course of time will disclose some of this information. And it's knowing that these things are like markers on here. And that for me is the signal, as many of you said, to say, this is someone who can handle that lane, right? So again, this is just more informational building for me and allows me to be able to provide resources, and it allows me to still manage my own stuff and where some of those things came from, right? So if I've experienced, which I have a number of these things, it gives me clues. Like I said, you know, before, it's not so much that I'm triggered, but I'm definitely activated still in some situations, and it's not the degree that it used to be, right? But some things will happen, right? I was getting my hair cut a couple of weeks ago, just sitting there chilling out. This guy walks in I haven't seen literally in 20 years, right? He was the person that like I did so much with, right? It's the person that like, he's connected to all my felonies. He's connected to some of the hardest times that I went through when I was actively using. And he walked in. Of course I was activated. Of course, all kinds of feelings and thoughts and stuff came up, right? And it's through tools of recovery, and it's through these things that I could say like, yep, I'm activated. And now I know how to manage and navigate through some of this stuff, right? So it's again, not allowing, it's not like I was triggered or I had to like, you know, ask the haircut place to like make a safe space for me, right? It was like saying like, no, this is what's coming up for me. And I get to choose what I get to do in all of this, right? And I get to choose to navigate through some of these pieces, right? Yeah, this is pretty intense stuff, right? And so one of the things too that I learned about through my own therapy experience, right? So it wasn't for me until 10 years in recovery that I was in a physically, mentally, and psychologically safe enough space to actually address childhood trauma, right? And it was on my 30th birthday. I was having breakfast with my mom, and she said, so-and-so just got out of prison for all these things that happened, right? That they did, right? It was a lot of like abuse stuff, right? And in that day alone, I probably purged more emotionally than I had the entire 10 years prior, right? And the floodgates just opened, and I had probably 2 years of intense, just like looking back at everything and like going through this really like excruciating experience of having to heal and deal with all of these things. And it was needed, right? But that was 10 years in, you know, like I was kind of guessing the whole time what some of the stuff was. So I'd like successfully oppressed, denied, and just kind of rejected all those things for that long until it was okay to bring that stuff up, right? And I like the metaphor, like, you know, in those first probably like 5 or 6 years of all of that, right? Maybe I don't like the metaphor, but I did what's called like shooting the elephants, right? Like taking care of the big ones, the biggest ones that are in the room, and addressing stuff, and like, okay, like I'm getting somewhere. But then it got to this point where I was like, well, how come it still feels a certain way, even though I've walked through all this stuff, right? And again, I'm just providing this in the context, not necessarily that you're going to go and talk to recoveries about their trauma absences, but more again from managing my own stuff. And it also then gives me broader perspective of saying like that, kind of to what Stacy's point was, like, I can remain curious about a person because I won't ever have the complete picture of them, right? But I can know like some of this stuff's in the back there, right? So the trauma absences, when you think of it, is like, what's the stuff that was just always there? It's kind of like a humming. It's kind of like a white noise of things, right? And the thing about them is that they don't necessarily like go away, right? So a lot of people experience these things, but when you've experienced a significant amount of trauma, it's kind of like being cracked open a little bit more and feeling and experiencing these things maybe on a daily basis, maybe on a weekly basis, right? And not really knowing how to, like, it's tough, right? They're passive traumas is another way to put them, right? So when my therapist introduced me to these, I thought this is incredible, and it helps, again, set the framework for broader community healing, right? Because in order for these things to happen, there has to be an environment or a system that allows for them to happen, right? There has to be other things that contribute to why this stuff went down the way it did, right? So the first one is like this failure to protect, right? This message and theme is, I don't deserve to be safe or taken care of. I handle danger on my own, right? So this is like not being protected as a kid, right? The people who were supposed to do it didn't do it. But it's not a fault thing, right? It's not like I blame them for lack of protection. It's not always about that, right? It's they did what they could. The environments, right, weren't there, right? Things happened outside the control of people, right? So there just wasn't protection available. And then that message then comes in like, okay, well, I'm the one who's then responsible for protecting me, right? And even into recovery, I could see places where like there was no immediate threat. There was no like danger going on, but I was like, who's in charge of protecting me right now, right? And relearning and what that is and what that looks like. And I associate a lot of these pieces too with like emotional maturity and emotional intelligence of just having to understand some of these pieces. And then failure to attune, right? Pretending to be someone so you like me. I don't let myself feel my needs, right? Like my example for this, when I was in middle school, I wasn't doing very well in school. A lot of my, looking back, I could say like a lot of my stuff like was just kind of like trauma and not knowing how to deal with a lot of feelings and a lot of things that were going on, just kind of spilling all over the place, right? And I disconnected in a lot of different ways in school. And I had this like, if you've heard of like the Big Brothers, Big Sisters program before, Big Pals program, right? It's a family that kind of like you can go to and like you hang out with them every week and kind of get like a little bit different structured of environment. And the guy that and his family I was connected with, you know, they were pretty well to do. And he comes in and he says, listen, you can have anything you want. You just name it, right? And if you can get a B average in school, I'll take you wherever, right? You just pick the place, Disney World, a football game, whatever it is, right? And so again, like when we think about this as coaches, we start maybe thinking about like recipients, right? And things like that, right? And you know, in that moment, I was like, this is awesome. Of course I'm gonna do great from here on out, right? I'm gonna set some goals and blah, blah, blah. And within a week, it was done, right? I no longer had the energy. Even the incentive, the carrot, if you will, was no longer helpful for me, right? Coincidentally, I met with this guy like a couple of years ago for lunch. And we were talking, I was talking about my small business and everything. And he's like, I'll tell you what, like, you know, if you can get your business to a certain place, like I can help you do all these things, right? And this guy's very like, you know, he's a CEO of a company and very like self-starter, pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of a thing. And I got that same feeling. I was like, oh man, of course I can do that. But then it occurred to me that was the same message so many years ago. And I stopped and I said, listen, Dave, I appreciate it. this is a really good concept, but I don't need that kind of incentive. I need you to attune to who I am. I don't need to like get somewhere to feel like I can gain something or some kind of reward. I need coaching and tutoring to get there. And that's exactly what I needed when I was younger too. I didn't need like Disney World. I needed someone to sit down with me every single day and walk me through the concepts, right? So this idea of attuning, again, like not only is something that I've become more aware of, but it's something I've become aware of with my children and how their needs are so individual and different to attune to them, to my recoveries, even to organizations and to places that I work with, like that attunement, or more or less like treating them like resources, is so valuable, right? But when there's constant expectation to act and be like, I remember I got into recovery when I was 20 years old, right? But emotionally, I was probably like 12 or 13, but I was still expected to act a certain way, right? Do this, get this done, you know, get your electric bill running, get all these things going. You're 20, figure it out, right? And that was tough, right? So again, like some of these things is like having this failure to attune, but also then like there's a large part of it where I had to be kind of this trauma chameleon, right? They even made a song about it in the 80s, trauma chameleon. They say it over and over again and they changed the words, but I learned how to blend in. I learned how to do those things to lame. Thanks, Randy. I don't know if we can remove Randy. I was kind of like, okay. So again, like not feeling my own needs, not knowing what I wanted, but then again, being able to come into those things throughout time, right? It's going to go through two more and then kind of get some feedback, questions, folks that can align with things. Randy says payback. I don't know what he's talking about. This is really strange. The next one, failure to choose, right? So I'm unworthy, I'm less than important. I'm sorry, did someone unmute and have a question?
Hold on.
Okay. So I'm less important than what you've chosen, self-doubt, right? So this is a situation where, you know, when I was given the examples where kids, like parents choose maybe drugs over the kid or choose work over the kid or all these things, right? And again, like it's not like this purposeful thing, right? And it can be construed in all kinds of different ways, right? So having some pre-existing kind of like stuff coming up, it could even be perceived that I was being chosen over, right? Even though, and that's a tough one, like even with having kids of my own, right? I'm like, well, because of what I've chosen to do, travel is an option, right? And now that travel's starting to come back around, the kids are like, oh man, you gotta go, right? And it sucks. And 90% is probably gonna still happen this way. But my fear, of course, sometimes is that they're feeling like it's a choice thing, right? And to help show them that it's not the same context. And the same thing can happen within recovery systems, within treatment systems and other places too, right? Where other priorities or needs get chosen over the individual. And again, like there might be a lot to weigh out in those situations. But for me, like when I've been in those places, it affirmed some of that stuff. I'm less important than what you've chosen, right? So again, having to relearn and unlearn some of those patterns throughout life has been a journey. And the last one, failure to stay. I'm not enough. I wasn't worth sticking around for. Self-abandonment. This one is particularly poignant for me. My dad was someone who was not around my whole life, right? I met him like 3 or 4 times, and then I had to go and take care of his belongings when he died from his alcoholism back in 2013, right? So for me, there was a steady, big, consistent portion of my life where I was constantly, you know, trying to find something to fill in that entire gap, right? And everything around me could easily affirm that I'm not enough and that there was abandonment going on around me, right? And so again, like this is something where like I had to stop looking for the external pieces and look for the internal pieces through recovery. And throughout the course of my journey and through therapy journeys, I've been able to see that. But again, a lot of these messages are ones that I'm not going to come out and ask a recovery, but I can certainly hear some of the language, right? I can certainly hear like, okay, especially when something resonates for me and there's like that kind of gut intuitive feeling around things. And again, I'm not going to rush and be like, oh, let's work on some positive affirmations for you, right? It's more about like, okay, when I look at the core components of being a recovery coach, and especially those ones of being like a stable and consistent person, when I look at those ones of like meeting people where they're at and being resources, like a lot of those roles and responsibilities align with these things that people may have experienced, right? And just doing that stuff, I think for me too, is like really like been both self-healing and been able to provide that for other folks. So questions, comments, things that come up for you around those 4 things. Again, like I just encourage folks, share as it feels okay. It can be heavy, it can be moving for some folks and activating for some folks. If we got to take some time to unpack and decompress, I understand that as well. Cold coffee break. Stacy.
Here, let me jump in. No, it was just funny how you were saying that as recovery coaches, sometimes just being the person that somebody can depend on, you know, like when you look back at some of those recovery coaching principles and all of those things, and we talk about being loyal, we talk about, you know, being that truth teller, we talk about being, you know, that friend and ally, and like all those hats that we wear for somebody gives somebody the ability to know that, you know, somebody's going to be there for them and somebody's with them through this journey, you know? And so regardless of where they are, regardless of what they're dealing with, even, you know, and Jesse, you use that like holding space for somebody, even if they don't have anything to say, or even if they're not sure what to say next. And it's okay to kind of live in that silence. Just being able to do that as a coach and know that that's okay is giving people who may be dealing with some of this stuff that trauma-informed care that we're talking about, right? Is that I don't necessarily have to have answers. I don't necessarily have to be the one that connects all the dots for this person. Sometimes I just need to be there, you know, and that's enough. So that's all.
Thank you.
Stacey, I think along those lines is provide that safe space so they can be, whether it's at the park, whether it's in my car or my office. You know, sometimes I get to be the guardian, if you will, of or their safe place keeper, you know, and people tend to feel that way when they're with me. Yeah. And that's just in my normal life, not in my paid life. You know, so why would I think it's any different when people feel safe enough around me to unveil and not feel like I have to fix them?
Right.
And come back and ask them, where do you want to go from here?
Yes.
I think this is fascinating because part of me thinks, well, I wish that it had not taken me so long to understand what part trauma played in my life. And I want like everybody to know, like, you know, gosh, if I had only known earlier, if I had only read this book or whatever, and makes me just want to tell everybody, but it's not appropriate. But like to Stacey's point and Jackie's point, like when we show up and we present ourselves in a way that is comforting, and somebody will say, oh, like you're notice that we're not running off. We didn't check a list and make a diagnosis that we're just sitting with them, or we're going to call them for days. You know, we're there for them. Then maybe they notice what the contrast is in their own life, and they can start to look at it. So we just sort of show up in a way that helps them to say what, kind of think about what feels good to them, maybe what they haven't had, or, you know, but yeah, I like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruth?
Jesse, fabulous presentation. Thank you. One of the things that I think the prism through which I look at any training is the question, how is this going to help me be a more skilled communicator in the coach role? And you have, towards the end of this particular piece, you actually gave an answer to that, where you directly referenced how being familiar or becoming familiar with the material that you're presenting gives me language and concepts behind language that I can be listening out. I can be listening for the language. I can be listening to what behind the words. We talked briefly in Recovery Coach Academy about listening for what isn't said. And I think that's a core value here. That what you're presenting here is material that or is a language net that I can be paying attention to. I can hear it when it's being said in the moment, and I can get into, oh yeah, right. This is what Jessie was talking about. So so let me adjust how I'm being and how I'm behaving in the conversation accordingly.
And that's, yeah, like, it's so, again, these things, when we talk about being a recovery coach and we talk about like the motivational interviewing aspect and being like, when I hit resistance, these might be one of those resistance pieces. And it's not that I have to go in and say like, oh, were you not attuned to as a 5-year-old? I have to say, how am I going to move myself then? Right. Or if someone is, was turned down as a sponsee, right? Like for some people, that's like just another day. For some people, that's like devastating, as we talk about, right? And that's gonna be, so then I'm like, okay, this is how I can continue to do these things. And so some of the messages, and again, like these are some that I crafted, but there's, others that I think are really helpful too, that people come up with on their own. And just being able to give my recoveries this language, it's safe to trust, right? Ask for what you need. You can choose self-care, you can commit, right? Just being able to like say, like, do these fit for you? Try this on, does this work for you, right? Because again, like it's about that empowerment piece. But I feel like sometimes there's like a false empowerment provided for folks where it's like, oh yeah, you can do all these amazing things, but I'm not going to necessarily give you the language or the tools to do such, I'm just going to kind of like, it's like performative empowerment, right? It's like, it feels good and we put it on a frame on our wall in the hallway, but I'm not actually doing it, because then if I did, you would be set up to succeed and move out of my services, hopefully within time, right? And even if that means coming back, that's fine. But, I want to continue to be able to see people, move out of this space if they can. And so there's nothing really like, I was given a PowerPoint of all of this. And so that Jennifer Wilgocki, who coincidentally lives in Madison, Wisconsin, I haven't really found anything like written. If you want like, oh, we need more books or want to read more about trauma absence. As far as I know, this is like the extent of the content to which is out there, unless she's providing some kind of like training herself, right? But again, just kind of like intro level. I've shared this with so many friends in recovery, just being like, I think I found it. Like, this is why I still feel this way. This is why I still have things come up, because there's passive things out there that just kind of strike a nerve still, that I'm like, okay, that's where that reworking and messaging needs to come in. So now we're going to move into, oh, John, go ahead. We'll move forward.
Yeah, sorry, I sort of come in. Yeah, thanks, Jessie. I'm finding this incredibly emotional because Nitha and Khalees know that I've been on a journey to sort of find myself more, and and become more real and more human and more caring and more, you know, understanding of people. And I'm looking at some of this stuff, and there's some real family trauma going on at the moment. And one of the things that I've become aware of, I don't know if it's a term or not, is micro-bullying. Yeah, just tiny little repeated bits of bullying. Yeah, and like you said, it's not an elephant. It's just tiny things going on all the time. And all of a sudden, I mean, when you think about this, I am less important than the thing you have chosen, and all of these things over the last 4 or 5 days, and it's been incredibly chaotic here. And I think there's real higher power stuff in me being here tonight and listening to all of you and the wonderful stuff people are saying, because all of a sudden it makes sense. All of a sudden, my feeling inadequate, my failure to support lovely close friends of mine because I feel inadequate, because I feel bullied, because I feel less than. And, you know, this, oh, I'll shut up before I start crying, but this journey with you lot is utterly fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for your vulnerability in these pieces. I agree. Like, this is powerful shifts, definitely, right? And to your point earlier, like, it's not about the big elephant traumas or the 10 that were even on that list. Like, it's so easy to pass over people's experiences because we lack nuance, right? And this to me just gives voice to that. Like, oh, it doesn't, like, I wasn't in a car wreck. I was in a slowly boiling pot and I didn't know it, right? 2 different experiences, but they can both come out with very real adverse effects. Ruth, go ahead.
Thank you. There are two things I wanted to say. First of all, I wanted to thank John very much for what he has just said. That's a terrific demonstration for us, I think, of using this space as a courageous space. And in saying that, John, I want to say how much you honor us by doing that. So thank you. The second piece, Jesse, actually, the second piece refers back to the previous slide before you move on, where we talk about this new messaging. This new messaging, for me as a recipient of this new messaging, it's just words. What I'm going to need from my coach is the how. How do these messages become live in my life? And what kind of conversation can I be having with my coach that bring these messages to life for me? Baby steps or bigger steps, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. And I think that, you know, sort of again, this gets to the core of what a coach can do. You know, sort of each one of those messages is a powerful invitation to an empowering conversation about the how.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to thank you for reminding us that you know that this is what our role is.
And to me, it echoes those pieces in the Recovery Coach Academy where we have sample statements of motivational interviewing. And again, like, those don't fit for everyone, right? It's like that ongoing making it our own art, right? And you know, that's the beauty of all of this, is like you said, like, okay, I've got some ideas of the language and what I might ask, and now I'm going to, you know, mold it into what I feel comfortable saying and what's going to be comfortable for the recovery. I think, Randy, there was I think Jackie was talking to John, and HP is Hewlett Packard. Oh, higher power.
Sorry, Randy. You were getting so much airtime that your name replaced John. That was for John, and he spoke about a higher power moment. And so I apologize.
Nope,
And
thank
not
you.
you, whatever.
Usually I do something wrong, so I'm just like, what did I do now? Like, so. Thanks.
Sorry.
It's
That's
okay.
for John.
Never a dull moment. I appreciate it. So this next part, where we're going to spend a little bit of time on now and then the rest tomorrow for part 2, is just kind of diving into this. Most of these components were taken from this article, Shifting from Trauma-Informed Care to Healing-Centered Engagement, right? And it's just kind of like content heavy, if you will. So again, providing you with some language and some concept around the framework and how you might be able to build this into your role as a recovery coach. And for me, the healing-centered engagement piece isn't just about like the one-on-one value, but it also speaks to my personal social justice systems values as well, of like, there's reasons, when you use that metaphor, like, you take the frog out of the pond to get it well, and then you bring it back and it gets sick again, right? And you're like, oh, the pond is what's poisoning the frog. This concept is like, yep, we need to get the frog healed, and we need to find out what's poisoning the pond, right? And again, how in this recovery lane, in this scope, can I learn how that's being done? And so Dr. Sean Ginwright wrote this article. He is a professor and a individual who's worked with a number of primarily Black youth within inner city Oakland. And this article starts out from him getting these perspectives from young men about trauma and about their experiences. And this article doesn't necessarily like open up the entire training. So like like I said, there's like a 7-hour or 7 module, not hours, not anywhere near 7 hours, way more, 7 module training about becoming healing centered, engaged and as a practitioner. So this is like a taste of some of that, but again, it's something that I've been utilizing for a number of years now and have trained on. So trauma-informed care offers a support and lens, but it has limitations, right? It presumes that trauma is an individual experience, right? Rather than a collective one, in which, again, what were the circumstances that allowed for something like to be able to happen? It requires that we treat people with trauma, but it provides little insight into what we might do to address the root causes in neighborhoods, families, and schools, right? So this, to me, is like direct language to when we talk about recovery community organizations, recovery high schools, college campuses, when we talk about, getting, families involved with recovery coaching system, right? This is why I'm like, yeah, lived experience is great, but we need everybody involved, right? And so I love, again, like this holistic collective attitude that healing-centered engagement comes in. Also trauma in culture and society, for sure. Yep. Definitely, there's a cultural and for all the means and definitions of culture, right? And where these things happen within certain communities, and then also like bigger, broader questions. And we've had a lot of those conversations, and what that means and what that's going to look like for folks. Again, it runs the risk, and tell me if this language sounds familiar. It runs the risk of focusing on treatment or pathology rather than fostering possibility. Right? When I read that, I was like, focus on the potential, not the pathology. It lined perfectly up, right? And so again, this is to move us out of that like kind of curated language of the pathology, and saying like we're going to take it one step further and look at possibility and potential with an individual, right? So, and I like these concepts too, right? The absence of disease doesn't constitute health. Absence of violence doesn't constitute peace, and reduction of pathology doesn't constitute well-being. So again, just because you remove these certain things doesn't mean that there's still not a cycle, right? Doesn't mean that there's still not conditions or passive traumas that are happening, right? But I also want to hear from all of you, when you read these, what comes up for you? What do you think about when you look at these and think about the kind of stuff we went through and stuff on your own experience and journey as a recovery coach? Stacy?
Well, I wrote it in the chat. When I think about these and I think about building recovery capital in people, and I think about the different things that we want to, help people to achieve, the goals that they want to set. It's not always just the goal around that addiction or what that sickness was or whatever it is, right? We are there to help them rebuild anything that they want to in their life, all of the things that maybe, took a back seat because of addiction. And now, because we've been able to maybe, get to a point where that isn't controlling our lives anymore, now we can rebuild relationships. Now we can think about things that we can do professionally, going back to school or getting a new job or whatever those things look like. Going and looking at our health in general, not just this one piece. And so when I think about this, it's not always just that one thing that needs to be healed. It's like there's always more that we're looking at, and that it affects more than just that one piece.
Thank you very much. Jackie?
Yeah, so it makes me think about, I can't transmit something I haven't got. And so I've never been, until now, 52 years old, an empty nester, with all these other variables going on in my life. But now that I've reached this point and found, again, my own healing and my own consistencies, healthy rhythms, that I can go and help even other people, more people, or the same people overcome those hurdles as well. So it's about my own ongoing transition and well-being, that I can still go back and, just from one of my pathways, I can go back and get more fish, or I can go and work with people on a broader spectrum, not just where I'm at in that moment, not only in that moment. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. I appreciate that. I thought I'd seen another hand up. Cleese, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, well, I was gonna say something, but Stacy kind of covered what I was gonna say. Is like looking at that whole person. Like whenever I was talking to one of our recovery coaches this week, and he made a really good analogy that, for example, he compared it to like the tube trains in England. He was like, you see it and there's all of these trails going all these different ways. And he was like, you can get somewhere, but they're still going to overlap. All of these problems might still overlap. They're not going to go away. They're still going to be there. And it's just kind of like focusing on that whole person, not just like the destination or that one problem. And so, yeah.
Thank you. And John?
Could you just, you made me think about, and I wrote in the chat, DSM-5. I don't know if everyone knows what the DSM is, but it's the diagnostic manual, and you're either sick or you're not sick. Yeah, you're either an addict or you're not an addict. Yeah, and a great friend of mine, Dr. Al Mooney, it drives him mad. He often harps on about what does he call it? The lack of positive valence.
Okay.
In medical diagnostics,
Okay.
you're just either mentally ill or you're not, and there's no in between. Thanks.
Thank you. And when I first saw this, and I was also trying to read your comment, Candace, too, and you're welcome to raise your hand or if you want to share some of these pieces. But when I think about what little I know about substance use disorder, right, is that it's cyclical, right? So it's like I'm in a pattern of kind of like, one, I believe that it's about survival, right? So my brain is hijacked. I'm doing all these things to survive, right? At least that's kind of like the Oh, take it easy. See you tomorrow. This will be recorded and all the good jokes come in later. So you're all night. But again, I think about cycles, and I've learned about cycles and different things. And you can talk about like family cycles and patterns and all these things, right? And one of the more confusing ones to me was always like, well, 180 from something isn't necessarily better, right? Because it's still part of the same cycle. And to me, what this means is that, and I love your reframing of this, Ruth, is that health is like breaking the cycle completely, right? And again, I don't see myself as a coach like going in and like investigating someone's cycles and all these things. But again, I rely on the values and the tenets that is the coaching that does help break the cycles, right? So when I ask someone, what do you think about this? They either choose to continue to be in that cycle, but when I help them explore all the options, they have to look outside of it, right? And so to me, that is like, that's the healing centered engagement, right? They become, kind of like, not from Jesse. I have a lot of burnt out one-liners. It's a cycle. And so what I'm going to work on is new material so that Randy can be amused during the training, because clearly that's what I'm here for. But again, like, this again, I guess that I hope that it's landing that for me, and my understanding of that is that it's not doing more than what's already offered in recovery coaching. It's knowing that what we're doing in recovery coaching is healing centered engagement, and we just do it really well. Except Randy. The next one, healing centered engagement, expands how we think about responses to trauma and offers a holistic approach. And again, we've heard that as well, fostering well-being, involving culture, spirituality, civic action, and collective healing. And again, all those components, when we think about those things, right? In one of William White's books, one of the ones that are really, really long, he talks about like the 7 cultures in active substance use disorder, and then transitioning into 7 cultures of like recovery, right? And what that means. And there's some simpler graphs behind all those things. But again, I think about that, like, having talked with people, like, what are the things that you understand as your culture, or how do you recreate those, right? So even helping people identify new things, right, and what that could look like, can help them move into a broader kind of community, right? And that might be RCOs, that might be coaching, that might be different things that looks like for them. Again, it's not looking at it as an individual experience, but highlights the way in which trauma and healing are experienced collectively. So again, these pieces to me are really important. It's strength-based. And so we talk a lot about, of course, like recovery coaching being strength-based, advances collective view of healing, right? And I think we as a community, when you look at CCAR, when you look at other RCOs, and we look at other, national organizations, right? Like at the end of the day, what I think everyone's trying to do is create collective healing, right? Because there's a lot of pain, right? Even as a recovery coach and as a person in long-term recovery for a little over 20 years, I've become somewhat numb and desensitized to the constant grieving process that's going on because of what happens in our community, right? Like it doesn't always hit the same when it's like, there was this many overdoses, this is how many people died from overdoses or alcohol or tobacco or things like that, right? And it's sad, right? And there's also a degree of like not wanting to feel it as much as I once did, right? So I look at it and I think like sometimes those are like the motivating factors behind the work that's being done, and everybody just has their own lens, in their own pathway as to how they address those things, right? But when we start to view healing as collective, right? When we start aligning all these different things, right? Then we can start seeing some real impact. And then again, it involves culture being a central feature in all of that, and culture meaning a lot of different things for different folks. But also addressing the strengths that already exist within those organizations, that exist within those places. Because again, it's this simultaneous view of, healing centered engagement is that of the coach and that of the kind of like the system at the same time, right? And knowing that we're kind of always dancing in between those things. And so this one I really like, and again, it echoes a lot of what we talk about, but I remember, personally, growing up and, getting into a lot of trouble in school. And there was this one situation where like, I must've been in 4th grade and, like I was just, like something just happened that day, right? Like there was just a number of things that went on. And for whatever reason that day, I was a particularly disruptive kid, right? To the point where the principal, like this old school, like Irish principal, I can say that with certain effect, he gathered a group of 6th graders to basically grab my arms and legs, drag me into the office as I'm kicking and flailing, right? This is a public school in Appleton, Wisconsin, kicking and flailing and forced down to sit there and wait until I calmed down by other students, right? And someone's off mute. And I remember, my mom came in eventually, and immediately we started talking about blame, right? We started talking about, why is your son this way, right? What's wrong with you as a parent that you can't control your kid, right? And then they look at me and say, well, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this, right? And so again, it was just a lot of blame and shame, and it was a lot of like, we're not going to look at any other things other than one behavior. So again, that trauma, right, being viewed as like, it's just an individual's experience, the family's problem, they're not doing the right things, right? And that, I can only imagine, right, what my mom felt about all that. I mean, if a principal ever tried to come at me like that, I'd be like, we're gonna have some conversation, right? Because I know a little bit more. But then, in the 90s and early 2000s, and trauma-informed care came about, and they're like, oh, let's talk about what happened to you, right? What happened to you that caused you to act out like that, right? And so we've been there for a while. We kind of plateaued with that approach for a long time, right? And healing-centered engagement now comes into what we all know as, well, what's right with you, right? So I presented this concept at a conference in Michigan. It was their mental health SUD conference. And I was talking about LGBTQ plus and addiction for providers. And I snuck in some HCE stuff just to kind of see how it would land with people, right? And yeah, getting paddled by principals, yeah. And I snuck this in and I said, like, here's some ideas and concepts just around healing-centered engagement. And one of the most profound pieces that came up was afterwards, there were these 2 folks that were in charge of a treatment center, right? And they said, listen, like our intake process for treatment goes as such. We're going to talk about all the crap that happened to you, all the crap that you did that got you here. We're going to spend like an hour or so, right? We're going to like find out what your drug of choice is, and we're going to do all this stuff to you, right? And then at the end of it, we're going to say, so tell us some good things about yourself, right? So that was my experience with treatment as well, right? We're going to run you through the gauntlet of all the shit, right? And then say, what are your hobbies? Tell us some good things, right? And then they said, we're going to switch that now. We're going to start out with what's right with you. What are your strengths? And if you can't name your strengths, we're going to give you a list of maybe what other people have. And we call that recovery capital, right? We talk about the internal and external resources that are available to us to sustain recovery, right? That's where we start. We start with recovery capital assessments and quality of life assessments to see where someone's at. And then we can say, oh, let's build goals from here, right? And so it was just like so simple, right? But it was this profound shift for intake workers to say, let's start with what's right with you and your strengths, and then go into some of the things that led you here, right? So the other part of this is that it exposed to trauma is like people are agents in creation of their own well-being rather than victims alone, right? And it's not to say like victim stance isn't a thing. Things happen to people. I understand that, and it's not removing that concept or label or identity or experience for people, but it's being able to say that people can be agents in the creation of their own well-being. And again, we do that through our listening, through our motivational interviewing, through them developing their own wellness plan, and then being able to say like, yeah, some stuff happened, definitely, right? And how you choose to address those things, I can provide you with a whole bunch of resources to help look at those, right? But for right now, we're going to say like you're in charge of, and I'm going to help support you in your recovery wellness planning and develop those pieces. Again, folks are not harmed in a vacuum, right? It's not just about the pond, you know, it's not just about the frog, it's about the pond. What are the conditions for it? How do you start changing those things? Well-being comes from participating in transforming the root causes of the harm within institutions. One of my favorite things, and again, I just was talking to Stacy earlier about like I should book my flights for Florida. When I was there, I want to say it was 2017, William White got up on the stage and he said, if you diverted 50% of the money allocated specifically for treatment into recovery support services, you would see a 60% reduction in the people that need those things. I don't know where he pulled those numbers out of. I'm going to trust him because he knows more than I do. And so I just kind of use that as like a thing I say. And then I say, if you've got a problem with it, contact William White. But what that means to me, right, is like, we're starting to just now see some shifts in allocating dollars to recovery support services because we know the value of it. He also, and this isn't to knock it, but I think it's important when he said, the treatment industry is an industrial complex that runs off recidivism and relapse, right? And I've talked to treatment providers about that, right? They wouldn't be around if someone didn't have to have 7 to 10 treatment episodes. Now in Wisconsin, there was some stats from a few years ago that 30% of people completed treatment, a 28-day program. And that's a lot of different reasons, right? Any other healthcare industry, if the completion rate was 30%, there would be a major overhaul of that whole thing, right? We would reassess why that is, right? Whereas in the recovery community space, and what's fascinating and amazing about what we do is we change what success is. We change what outcomes are, right? I'm not looking to have you been clean for 30 days. I'm looking at have you improved with your own wellness in 30 days. It's again that about shifting into that resource piece. And I know I'm missing like a ton of comments here. And I will come back to those. I'm going to get the transcript from the chat as well. So the last piece before I open it up for some conversation and question is I love this quote. And it was first given to me. So I went to a conference in San Francisco a few years ago called Wisdom 2.0. And it was like this group that brings in a lot of tech companies, but then they also bring in like a lot of mindfulness leaders. And so like, this is about the time Google was launching the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. And, you know, they had all these different speakers there. And coincidentally with this training, there was a panel of folks from the East Bay Meditation Center based in Oakland, California, who's done a ton of like advocacy work, and they align their own kind of spiritual principles with social justice pieces. And so the way the conference worked is like they would just do the panel, and then they'd go to a second stage, and then they would do a Q&A with folks, right? It was a really cool concept. I like how they did it, right? Because it allowed people that were interested in that to speak to them, but also allowed people to sit in the main things as well. And so at the time, and I've learned a lot since then, I thought I was just like one of the most woke people in the audience. And so I'm going to ask this panel of people of color, like, and raise my hand and say, like, listen, I know I'm doing really great at my job as being an advocate and ally for everyone. What can I do better, right? And I was just ripe with ego and with performativeness and with like attitude about it, thinking I was doing something right. And this woman stops me, one of the board of directors women, and she says, you need to stop with that. You need to stop with this allyship stuff. You need to stop with this othering, right? That you have something that you're going to come in with and think that you're going to save me, or that you're going to save my community because you have all these things, or because you think you understand, or you think you know, kind of a thing, right? And she said, when you understand that your liberation is bound up with mine, then we can start to work together, right? And then I associated that and I thought back and I'm looking at all these different things, right? When we had the crack epidemic in the 90s, right? We didn't have task forces. We didn't have SOR dollars. We didn't have all this response to when people were hurting, right? We assumed that was that problem for that community, and we're going to do these things. And the same thing happened. I can look back to all the way to 2009 when I was getting emails and I was having conversations with folks in inner city Milwaukee, when I was having folks in conversations in rural, places in Wisconsin that were being hit already by the opioid epidemic, but it wasn't their problem yet. It hadn't hit places of privilege. It hadn't hit places where people thought that their liberation was somehow bound up with someone else's, right? And it continued to escalate. And then years went by, and then finally we have some kind of response, right? So when I go to these organizations and I say, listen, we need to really reframe this conversation, right? You're not going to get out of this the way that we've been doing it the whole time. It requires healing-centered engagement. It requires a holistic approach, right? It requires folks like me to sit down, shut up, and step back. And it requires opportunities to be given and to be lifted up in places where they haven't been in the past. With that, that is the end of part 1. Questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, opinions, ideas, sarcastic remarks, except for from Randy. Oh, he's gone. Good. I didn't want to open that up to him. No. Yes, Neetha.
Thanks, Jesse. This was really good. And it's just made me think about a few conversations I've had over the past few weeks. One of them was about a group of women who have all had their children taken away from them permanently. They will not get them back. That's just not an option. And how do we support them? And this, I just think, has, just planted some seeds and touched my heart. So I'm really grateful. And I recently I said, I question everything I do now, and I just say, am I doing this from a point of vanity or sanity? And if there's any slight bit of vanity in it, it's not happening. And just, we've always said, and I've always said, that I want everything I do to be heart-centered, and this just sits right there with it. So I am really grateful for you bringing this information and sharing it with us, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Ruth?
Thank you so much, Jesse. This 90 minutes has been exactly what I had hoped for, and I look forward to tomorrow. Looking at this particular quote, I love this. And this is very much, sort of where I've always lived. But it reminds me of this very specific context of our field. It reminds me of that a suggestion to identify, not compare. What we're doing is we're identifying those commonalities that link us, and I think that Lila has captured the what William White might refer to as the big A in advocacy dimension of that. That, sort of, I identify with you, you identify with me in our common struggles, in our common achievements, in our common strengths, at a personal level. And what Lila is asking us to do is to translate that identification into the big picture, where we're talking about cultures and societies and ways of being together. I absolutely love it. This has been a very rewarding 90 minutes, Jesse. Thank you again.
Thank you. And this too then readdresses the paternalizing paradigm that oftentimes funders and counties want to come in, we're going to come help the addicts that don't know how to run their own lives. We can figure that out for them, right? And what's always fascinating about that is that like when those groups come in, we end up finding out, or I end up finding out, like there's so many people already impacted by it, right? But there's like this, I don't want to say it's clearly just in like an American society culture, but like people will come in that are wounded or impacted this certain way, but they don't want to admit it. So they come in and think they can help by doing it through their job or their company or through funding or something like that, or because people can't control themselves. And that's their way, that's like their gateway into, if you will, funding, philanthropy. It's the gateway drug to helping people. So again, like being able to come in and be like, listen, like if you pay taxes, you're impacted. And we've been saying this stuff forever, right? Like if you live in America, you've been impacted by this, right? So don't try to separate yourself from us, right? We're all kind of connected. And to me, these are like, this aligns too with a lot of like principles in my own kind of faith journey as well. Just like the interconnectedness and knowing that folks have inherent worth and dignity. So that's all I've got. Stacy?
It's funny that like this always comes up when you think about things that align with social justice, right? You see like a cause and then you have to come in and you want to like help with the cause, but you expect the people that are most affected by the cause to tell you how you can do it. And so you're then marginalizing people again, because like, well, I want to help you, but tell me what I need to do, expecting them to do all of that work and whatnot. And so, you know, when you think about the big movements, and I won't get into all of them because I know there are several several hot topics, and I don't want to go there, but this is where I really see the youth that are coming up right now, and like they're all allies to each other. You know, like there is no other in a lot of the youth groups that we have. They're all coming up together, and they're working together on, you know, the environment and racism and the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, like there's so much that is happening with this current young generation that it makes me hopeful, because I see a lot of them seeing themselves bound in the oppression that other groups are feeling, you know. So in our time, you know, it was always that kind of privilege and whatnot. And I'm seeing, I guess, less so as I'm seeing my kids come up, that they're just more accepting or more just trying to be one huge unit of people, you know, instead of how they're different, they're connecting with how they're similar. So I see them being bound up, and I think that those are lessons that sometimes we have to be vulnerable and kind of do the work, you know, or come in and say, you know, I don't know the answers, but I need to figure them out, and I can't have you like, I can't go to you to tell me what those answers are, you know, because that's also invoking my privilege. So I really liked this a lot.
Anyone else?
I have a quick question.
Hello.
The healing centered model, did I say that right? Is that a coaching? Was that derived from a coaching theory, or is that?
Yeah, so I think he came in a little bit after the intro to it. So the healing centered engagement was a term developed by Dr. Sean Ginwright with an organization called the Flourish Agenda. And so I had originally learned about it from an article in 2018, which we're going to send links out to. And so a majority of this has just been about like how we relate that concept to the recovery space field, and how there's a lot of alignment, you know, with it, and what it means for us as coaches to potentially incorporate some of those ideas as we do these things.
Yeah, I would like to learn more about this. I work at the Milwaukee LGBT Center, and there's a two-part role. Well, now it's a two-part role. First, it was just ALDA therapist, and now that I'm a recovery coach professional, that's an added component to the center there, which is so working with LGBTQ populations. Healing seems to be the primary focus when working with individuals. So this component here would fit and tie into my current role. So I would really like to learn more about this one.
Yeah, and I'm definitely, like, I've done work with the center in the past, and I've done a lot of work with diverse and resilient in the past. So I know exactly where you're at. So definitely reach out sometime. I used to work with some of the execs down there. It's good times.
Yeah, I'm trying to, but yeah.
Yeah, it's all good. I just want to make sure we land on time for folks and be mindful of that piece. So again, tomorrow we start at 1 Eastern.
Yep. Same time, same place.
Yeah.
1 p.m. Eastern on this very link, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and listening and sharing so openly and honestly. And thank you, Jesse, for leading some great conversations. Much needed, much appreciated. Thanks all for being here. And please come back tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern to 2:30 p.m. Eastern, and maybe a couple of minutes over if discussions get a little rowdy. All right, so I will see you all tomorrow, and I'm going to stop the recording now.